And welcome to the 5th Howard Rain Memorial Lecture. And it's a great pleasure to welcome everyone who's online, including Corinne and members of the Rain family across the globe, and also to our audience live in the Avenue campus. Before I introduce our speaker and her title, just to say a little bit about Howard Rain, who is one of our dearly loved students, an MA student initially, and then a PhD student working on medical history, hence the focus on Jewish medical history as the focal point of the Rain lectures. Howard was a very talented and very humane man who, with Corinne, was very much part of the Parks community, a regular to our events, and a wonderful presence at it. Howard was in a way, old-fashioned GP, caring for his patients, and a very wonderful doctor. And then late in his career, he branched out and in a way that is sort of, for those of us of limited talent, having mastered the art of being a medical man, became a very good and talented medical historian. And his focus was initially on anti-alienism in the UK and the health element of that, and then moved on with his PhD, which was a study of 2 migrant origin hospitals that were formed in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Jewish hospital, which came a bit later, and earlier the German hospital, both of them in London. And Howard, despite illness in the last stages, very bravely managed to finish and defend his thesis. So in his memory, we have these series of lectures, and we've had some very distinguished lecturers working on very different elements of medical history, and tonight will add very richly to that tradition. Howard was also something that really challenged me as a PhD supervisor, a fanatical Leeds United fan. I've grown up in the 1970s, when visiting Ellen Road in Leeds was not a pleasant experience. So I developed a profound hatred of Leeds United. And it was something to be said for Howard's humanity and warmth that I actually grew to be quite fond of them and watched their progress back into the Premiership, and then more recently their decline back into the Championship with some interest and empathy. So they're back up on the up, and I'm sure Howard is looking fondly from above at their progress. So Howard, it will remain with us, his presence and his decency, and the family connection is something that we value very, very deeply. So moving on to tonight's lecture, very pleased that we can welcome Jaclyn, who is Senior Lecturer in Modern Jewish History at Cardiff University. I've had pleasure of reading a lot of her work, and especially her major monograph, International Jewish Humanitarianism in the Age of the Great War, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, which has been award-winning and has achieved something which I think is very, very hard to achieve in the writing of Jewish history, to contextualize it in wider histories, but also to be truly transnational, international in its approach, and to do justice to very many different elements. And that's a very difficult thing to do. She has worked on other projects, and one I would sort of mention more recently, which I've sort of seen slightly from the edges, but is a fascinating one, is a project supported by the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, on Jewish country houses. And this is a very neglected one, and one that has a strong sort of local feel. So many of our students are at halls of residence, which were part of a sort of network of the Swaveling family, where they, at weekend retreats, would hunt wild animals, but are now integrated into the university halls of residence complex. and not that far away, Exbury House, one of the Rothschild estates, and so on. So even locally, this is a neglected history which is being explored both in terms of research, but also in public outcomes in very, very impressive exhibitions, and is ongoing. So I think we'll all really look forward to further outcomes of that. But tonight, Jaclyn, this is a result of teaching from 9 o'clock this morning. I'm doing a walking tour this afternoon, so I'm still deep frozen and sympathize with the sufferings of fish fingers. Jaclyn is going to talk to us tonight on the Great War and the inception of Jewish medical humanitarianism. Jaclyn.
Great. So good evening to everyone here in the room and online. It's really an honor to give this year's annual RAIN lecture. And I want to thank Tony and Claire and Neil and the whole RAIN family for making this possible. Within weeks of the outbreak of the Great War in the summer of 1914, American Jews rushed to send relief for suffering Jews caught in the crossfire of crumbling empires. Over the next 15 years, American Jews built an unprecedented humanitarian infrastructure in a long-term project to protect, rebuild, and remake Jewish life abroad. To do this, they drew on models of modern Jewish philanthropy and joined American humanitarian initiatives of the early interwar years, sending tens of millions of dollars and American Jewish experts abroad. In the immediate aftermath of war, Jews died in disproportionately high numbers in a typhus epidemic, which, as I will explain, humanitarian organizations were either powerless or unmotivated to address. Yet the war, despite the literal ills it brought for European Jews, was a catalyst for a broad program of international and local Jewish health activity that reignited and redirected social changes sweeping through Jewish society well before the war. So let me start with the war itself. The war was a calamity to the world at large. To the Jews, it was a disaster of stupendous proportions. This assessment of the Great War by historian Abraham Duker was published on the eve of the Second World War. And then, in the inconceivable horror of the Holocaust, the Great War was promptly forgotten, never to be fully excavated. The Great War, however, sent the Jewish world into a tailspin. On this map of pre-war Europe, you can vividly see the way in which the western edge of Russia abuts the big neighboring German and Austro-Hungarian empires, with the Ottoman Empire just to the south of a few small states. And this whole band would comprise the Eastern Front of the war. In 1914, on the eve of the war, out of about 14 million Jews in the world, 6 million lived in the Russian Empire, long legally confined to that shaded western edge of Russia, the Pale of Settlement. The Eastern Front thus stretched across the region where the majority of Jews in the world lived at the time, from Vilna and Poland to Galicia and Eastern Austria-Hungary, Ukraine and Romania. And Jews also lived throughout the Ottoman Empire, which was also at war. Jewish civilians and soldiers suffered terribly. And it was about 7 million Jews who were estimated to really bear the brunt of the war's violence, which meant that Jews were subjected to pogroms, including mass rape, destruction of property, deportation, all of these things were violence, forms of violence directly targeted at Jews, as well as privations affecting all civilians in the war zones, such as hunger, cold, and illness. They were impoverished, displaced, and desperate. Beyond untold deaths, several 100,000 from war-related pogroms alone, the war displaced more than 1 million Jewish refugees, created tens of thousands of Jewish war orphans, awakened intense anti-Jewish violence, and brought about the wholesale destruction of the Jewish market towns known as the shtetl, and with it a way of life. As European empires self-destructed and were reformed as nation states, Jews were also caught in the crossfire of the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, plus the Polish-Soviet War, and the fighting surrounding the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This is all merely to summarize in broad terms. You might be shocked to read testimony from this era, especially if you've never really thought about the Great War in this way. And I certainly do recognize the resonance of some of what I'm saying in these quotations with what just happened on October 7th. And we can talk about that more in the questions if you want. The Great War and major restructuring of the map and political power in its wake brought the Jewish question into sharp relief from where it had been hanging over European society throughout the previous century. I conceptualized this idea of the Jewish question more as Jewish questions, a series of interrelated, hard to resolve issues, all of which fall under a greater question having to do with how Jews were to fit into modern society. The Balfour Declaration, announcing a Jewish national home in British Mandate Palestine, the emancipation of the Jews in revolutionary Russia, and a series of minorities treaties in East Central Europe negotiated as part of the peace, all brought different possible sweeping political answers to the Jewish question into existence around the Great War. And I would argue that the Jewish humanitarian effort that emerged in response to this war could be understood as a fourth sweeping answer. So in retrospect, we can really see that the Great War era marked a crucial turning point in modern Jewish history, probably second only to the Holocaust. And given that and its relationship to the Holocaust itself, it's actually remarkable how little we hear about it. As European destruction raged and European charities were themselves engulfed in the war effort, US neutrality during most of the war provided an opportunity for Americans to serve a key wartime role as humanitarians. International humanitarianism had already long been associated with rapid medical aid, mainly due to the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva in 1863, and then a growing worldwide network of national branches of Red Crosses. This independent organization, when it first began, was about providing medical aid to combatants. But in the Great War, the Red Cross, especially the American Red Cross, began to transition to helping civilians via medical and child welfare initiatives. And this showed that branches themselves could work overseas in response to a crisis as a form of soft diplomacy. The American Red Cross and other Red Cross initiatives in this Great War era seemed to grow out of a strand of progressivism associated with women called maternalism. So the nurses of the Red Cross could extend the domestic sphere into medical care and care for children. So we have a familiar story about the significance of American involvement in the Great War, which mostly has to do with Wilsonianism, self-determination, the peace conference after the war, and the creation of an ultimately Americanless League of Nations. But this familiar story does not include soft diplomacy, non-state activism, or social politics, despite their importance. The war actually promoted the growth of new civil society organizations, especially in America. And these organizations took their American visions abroad to help others with the support of the US government, which had no programs like USAID in place at the time. Quasi-governmental humanitarian organizations, such as future US President Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross, plus this whole other plethora of civil society organizations, from the Quakers to Smith College to the Rockefeller Foundation and the Near East Relief, they all got involved abroad. And American Jews, well, they specifically founded the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which I'll be calling the Joint, to aid Jewish war sufferers. And the Joint positioned itself as part of this plurality of humanitarian war relief organizations coming from America. So the Great War marked the beginning of an important relationship in the humanitarian sphere overall, of the US State Department and with private American relief organizations cooperating to conduct humanitarian relief abroad for the first time. To move aid in wartime, American Jews, who were the largest group of Jews in a neutral country, there were about 3 million American Jews at the time, they needed to work with the US government, which was the largest neutral power. So cash aid traveled to Jews in the war zones through the US diplomatic pouch, and also through Jewish family connections. Pre-existing independent Jewish organizations in Central Europe and in Russia delivered the cash and remittances, and US naval ships were able to bring aid past the blockade to Palestine. But to achieve this kind of close cooperation with the US government, the Joint's mission and work style had to dovetail with that of this emerging American humanitarian sector. When the Joint was founded in 1914, the need for a separate Jewish American humanitarian organization to respond to the crisis in Europe was debated. At the turn of the 20th century, social welfare programs in the US were still mainly the province of private organizations, often organized less around the kind of welfare provision they provided, but more around group membership by religion, national origin, class, or some kind of combination thereof. Jews, no matter where they lived in the world, had their own rich institutional fabric. In Western liberal countries, as social services became rationalized, scientific, and more state-oriented, and as Jews became increasingly acculturated into and integrated into those states, separate organizations were increasingly frowned upon, even as most general or mainstream organizations remained under the control of the majority elite who were not Jewish. In a telling conversation, Joint leaders Felix Warburg and Louis Marshall, who are both in that painting somewhere, the guy at the very front is Felix Warburg. Joint leaders Felix Warburg and Louis Marshall debated whether there ought to be an independent Jewish sectarian organization. And Warburg worried that the American Red Cross, in particular, might see a separate organization as an excuse to exclude Jewish sufferers in its own plans. Marshall contended in response that, I quote, "All these non-sectarian, non-partisan dispensation of charity sound very well, but it only means that we receive nothing from the other altruists, but are giving up the money which of right belongs to those who have a distinct right to appeal to us, namely our own co-religionists." And it was in the area of health where the question of Jewish separateness and the nature and role of humanitarian welfare seemed to come into sharpest relief. The cause of Jewish health raised all kinds of questions about who got health relief in the new post-war order. And eventually it became a source of Jewish apolitical resistance to oppression, serving as a way for Jews to reconstruct and even seek to improve their status after the war through incremental change. But at the same time, as medical activism took a central role in the humanitarian diplomacy of World War I and its aftermath, the Joint was able to use medical humanitarianism to stay within the American humanitarian sphere, and by creating this kind of robust medical program. It was not automatic, besides it not being automatic that there would be a Jewish organization to arise at all, it was not automatic that such a new Jewish international philanthropy would have a medical dimension. So I see the Joint and its Jewish humanitarianism as growing out of a convergence between the educational reform programs and rights advocacy of Jewish elites in the metropoles of the great European empires, with what it meant to be an American humanitarian organization responding to the crisis of the First World War. And of course, the First World War was itself taking place in and accelerating a medical and scientific revolution. I mean, this happened in many dimensions, but you could just think about like creation of antibiotics, plastic surgery. These type of things are a result of the First World War. The old Jewish international philanthropies, like the Anglo-Jewish Association and the Alliance Israélite Universelle, had previously set up schools networks in their respective imperial Jewish peripheries, and they had trained a mostly female cohort of teachers in their metropoles. But the Joint, it never set up its own school network. And as you'll see, instead, it focused on medical humanitarianism and on children's health. And it created nurse training programs, the same kind of female cohort of that were kind of professional class of women teachers, but they did it on site. In this map, you can see the refugee crisis created by the Eastern Front. The map's in my book. The arrows indicate the direction of Jews fleeing as refugees from the war zones along the Eastern Front, which is, you know, I've been trying to count this through like a variety of kind of statistical material, but it's more than 1 million people. The Great War, therefore, marked the most extensive, most rapid geopolitical displacement in Jewish history since late antiquity. And during the war itself, the Joint could only send money over to the war zones, but some of its recipient distributing Jewish organizations, such as the Russian Jewish Relief Organization, had a medical program, which expanded from aiding Jewish soldiers to assisting civilian war sufferers. This Russian Jewish Medical Relief Organization, called the OZE, had privileges, just like the Red Cross, to help Jewish refugees with army supplies. And when Jews were deported eastward into the Russian interior from the Eastern Front, so like those arrows going eastwards from the Pale of Settlement, the OZE responded by sending mobile ambulatory units in train cars to accompany those deported refugees. But in general, epidemics were controlled by heavy-handed military authorities during the war, both in Russian and German occupied territories. The revolution in Russia, however, put the OZE and public health generally into a deep crisis in Russia. And endemic typhus mushroomed into an epidemic crisis, particularly in Ukraine, where Jews were concentrated, threatening to spread all along the Eastern Front. I have to say that another reason I'm showing you maps and just kind of refugees in general is that I have never actually seen any images of these like ambulatory trains. There are some existing images of Red Cross trains in the years afterwards, but if anyone ever sees those, let me know. Meanwhile, just before the outbreak of war, American women Zionists, under Henrietta Zold's guidance, had just begun to create a Jewish visiting nurse service for women and children, exporting the likes of Lillian Wald's Henry Street settlement in New York to Palestine. Hadassah, as this new organization was called, kept medications traveling to Palestine on shipments that the JDC negotiated past the British blockade. And by 1918, pre-armistice, a full medical delegation had set sail from New York to Palestine. So Hadassah was really kind of on this particular medical dimension during the war. It was part of Hadassah's post-war, during the war and post-war planning. After the armistice on the Western Front, Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross rushed into the fragile new nation states of Central and Eastern Europe, which are on this map in purplish, and violence was ongoing there. The American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross were, of course, going to provide relief, especially major food aid programs. And the food aid programs also involved distributing medicines and various sanitary supplies and providing relief of a variety of kinds for children, especially. The Joint managed to jump immediately aboard these other American emergency relief efforts, which is how it was able to reach and work actively in Poland by early 1919, and later in Russia, where the Jews were in greatest need. And sort of over the course of 1919, 1920, American relief workers were deployed around Europe for this task. So the task consisted at first of distributing emergency food relief, meds, and sanitary supplies, and clothing, basically to help civilians through the harsh winter. And so here you can see the Joint shipping some kosher beef off from New York on its way to Danzig for distribution by a Joint social worker in Poland. But in August 1919, a Joint conference in New York, like the Joint's various workers had come to New York to talk and assess its emergency post-war relief and to make some future plans. Major Chaim Davis, who was a psychiatrist in the American Expeditionary Forces, accused the Joint of failing Polish Jews. They had had a sole social worker in Poland since February 1919. And although he had done the work of a dozen men, Chaim Davis said, and that had included some medical work, the Joint had neglected to send a single medical doctor, instead sending scouts, engineers, and social workers. On the other hand, Solomon Lowenstein, a social worker, had just returned from an American Red Cross commission to Palestine, and he reported to the conference that the American Zionist Medical Unit, which is Hadassah's medical unit, had already begun post-war medical work. And he deemed the Palestine situation as comparatively very fortunate. And it was true. Oddly, in still volatile Eastern Europe, where this typhus epidemic was raging, social workers and engineers were acting as health professionals. The borders between social work and nursing were pretty porous in humanitarian relief, and yet clearly Hadassah was doing something that the Joint needed to do. So that conference led to the Joint's own unsteady launch of a joint medical program. So the Joint focused its efforts along the Eastern Front, the former Eastern Front of Europe, but it was still besieged by violence from the ongoing Polish-Soviet War and the Russian Civil War, and typhus was quickly spreading and killing in its wake. So typhus is spread by lice, body lice, and it gets spread when there is an underfed, underclothed, unsheltered, transient, and traumatized civilian population. The same disruptive social forces which permitted the louse to flourish made combating the disease through louse control and supportive care of those infected nearly impossible. I want to note that there are almost no existing reports in these regions, from these regions, or even like kind of centrally in Europe, of the so-called Spanish flu epidemic that had emerged in 1918. And I have spent a lot of time trying to think about why, but my guess is that the kind of lack of even trying to do anything about the flu in these areas had to do with the flu presenting as a far lesser threat. So that might provide you with some sense of just how bad conditions were generally if the flu, which kind of in safer places was all the news, so the flu was unmentioned, and how very lethal and terrifying typhus was if it was so noticeable amid this incredible destruction and destitution. The Joint in particular found itself waging a campaign for care and health of the Jews, while other organizations tended to see Jews as carriers of contagion who should be isolated rather than brought back to health. There was little international political will to and many structural barriers to combating typhus, both in the new Polish state and Soviet Russia, and also in the war zones in between, which meant it took until late 1919 and early 1920 just for some kinds of competing or sort of collaborative efforts to get underway to try to control the disease. And when you think about what recently happened in the first year of the COVID pandemic, say, think about the international incoherence, the border tightening, the nationalist and racist kinds of responses 100 years ago make perfect sense. The Joint sent its own program to fight an epidemic in an attempted collaboration with the American Expeditionary Forces Typhus Group, with European governments, and with the League of Nations Health Committee. Not only did the Joint wish to save the Jews in Eastern Europe from succumbing to the disease, but it also wanted to end the contagion for the sake of Jews in other places who primarily risked the effects of rising anti-Semitism in its wake. But as one Joint leader noted, of course we realize that by ourselves, we cannot in any way cope with this plague. While the Joint thus concentrated its efforts primarily in building collaborative networks, it was proved very difficult to work with a rather anti-Semitic American Red Cross, and the American Expeditionary Forces wanted its military delousing resources back at home, not loitering in Poland. And it had sort of become clear by 1919, 1920 that probably typhus was no longer going to spread all the way west. And that rising immigration restrictions alone, without actually doing the work of kind of local delousing and sanitation, could probably keep typhus out. Harry Plotz, the Joint doctor sent to Poland to investigate the typhus situation, described a demoralizing vicious circle in which poor conditions, lack of infrastructure, high mobility of louse-infested refugees and repatriates, and low morale just meant that people continue to die. He was horrified that persons already infected by typhus were just like abandoned, left to their fate. In the winter of 1920, he noted that Kiev cemetery records indicated that 25,000 Jews, which was nearly a quarter of the Jewish population there, had died of typhus within 6 weeks. He urged urgent, international, and collaborative medical care, as the Polish government's efforts were underfunded and ineffectual. He knew that Jews also did not trust the health advice coming from the Polish government, since, and I quote, under the guise of health propaganda, anti-Semitic literature is distributed, and in the zeal for cleanliness, beards are violently shaved and pogroms occur. He felt that only a Jewish organization like the Joint would have any hope of gaining the trust of Jews. But his ambitious plan required so much money and personnel that it took a really long time to try to figure out how to plan something. And meanwhile, the collaborative aspect never came through. Eventually, a team of 18 American Jewish medical experts spread out through Poland in 1921 and were able to diffuse some localized typhus outbreaks. That's what I want. So like a team above that, there's a delousing machine in the back there. Like they could sometimes travel to a town, a shtetl, or a city, a small city, with this machine and kind of actually get outbreaks to subside. But that was a lot of work, and it was not that many people. Despite the Joint's and others' hopes to organize a kind of real coordinated international battle against typhus in Eastern Europe, such coordinated action just never materialized. By the time the Joint got medical relief to Poland in early 1920, the American-Polish typhus expedition was disengaging. And then reaching Jews in Soviet Ukraine took the Joint even longer. It was late 1921, before the League of Nations and then a Hoover-led American initiative responded to a famine in Russia and slowly began to allow outside humanitarian access to Russia. And in that particular sphere in Soviet Ukraine, there was no humanitarian medical program. Yet Jews and other locals were still suffering from typhus and other diseases. There was just very little international concern for their well-being. But the Joint's Medical Commission did not itself have the manpower, nor the equipment to battle typhus alone, nor did they have the funds or the resources of government necessary to give them the kind of authority that might enable them to collaborate as a true partner. Devoting resources to curing those with typhus or preventing new cases was about political ends, and no government or even the quasi-governmental humanitarian relief organizations seemed to care. Jews, as one of the primary populations on the move westwards and further linked with Bolshevism and the anti-Semitic imagination, were instead, by these organizations, perceived as carriers of contagion and Bolshevism. And a Western impulse to keep Europe safe from Bolshevism and from disease meant that Jews were to bear the brunt of a quarantine against both Bolshevism and disease. For while Western governments had started collaborating at a research level after the Great War on kind of medical questions, their on-the-ground epidemic strategy consisted mainly, in the end, of sanitary cordons, so like raising up borders, quarantines, and in short, protecting only themselves against diseases. If Jews were overrepresented among the typhus victims, they were barely represented at all in the battle to fight against typhus. No one private organization could have possibly tackled a problem that politically fraught and that contagious, even if that organization was more motivated to do so than any government. However, that ongoing struggle to negotiate a collaboration to fight typhus meant that Jewish healthcare more generally, by Jews and for Jews, was reestablished in Europe. The Joint could not heal Jews dying from typhus fast enough or contain the epidemic, but it could promote health among Jews in a more achievable way that might help the millions of Jews who had survived epidemic and war. Jewish social medicine looked inward for strength and strived towards self-sufficiency while still crossing international geopolitical borders. And rather than joining the projects of medical research and scientific standardization that became the focus of other international health organizations in the interwar period, Jewish organizations did more what states had started to do domestically since the late 19th century: extend social health measures beyond epidemic control to public health promotion more generally. And so, as other American organizations, including the American Red Cross, left Europe in the early 20s, the Joint just stayed. And one of the things it did was create a social medicine program in addition to its work with refugees, children, and economic rehabilitation. Although I argued earlier that Jewish medical humanitarianism was a phenomenon linked to the First World War, the Joint was, of course, building on a relationship of Jews and health that had begun before the war. Beginning in the late 19th century, an unprecedented number of Jewish men and women had entered the field of medicine in Russia, and healthcare had become a force for the modernization of Jews in the Pale of Settlement in the late 19th century. Jewish social medicine was a fairly convincing project for Jewish self-improvement. And in the years leading up to the war, philanthropic activity had been organized around Jewish health. So again, the OZ had been founded in St. Petersburg in 1912. And as I've mentioned, Hadassah had already sent a handful of American nurses to focus on maternal and child health for Jews in Palestine in 1913. And at first, the war seemed like a setback to this nascent activity. But eventually, the upsurge in American Jewish humanitarianism abroad due to the war ushered in an interwar golden age of Jewish social medicine in Europe and in Palestine. So-called Jewish pathologies, such as tuberculosis, phavis, typhus, and trachoma, became the main target of Jewish social welfare organizations. And the programs expanded outward from there towards this really ever-expanding vision of Jewish health. And in this way, Jewish self-help organizations, both local and international, sought to civilize Jews and transform them through health into acceptable modern citizens. And this coincided with a general post-war shift from charitable medicine for the sick to community and preventative health measures for all, mostly at a state level. And from entirely domestic programs, state-level programs, to at least a few international projects, Jewish relief synced up with the preoccupations of international organizations at that particular moment in time, with a particularly American progressive concern about public health and spreading American scientific practices to improve health in less civilized parts of the world, which now included post-war Europe. And attempts to control typhus had already placed Jewish health into this orbit of international health work more generally. Arguments could easily be made for the need for Jewish-specific public health and medical programs. So, for example, treating an epidemic through education and intrusive personal intervention seemed to require, or you could argue that it would require, Yiddish-speaking doctors and nurses. And fortunately, since medical doctors were indeed a common profession among Jews in Europe, there was also the potential for more built-in communal expertise than there was within mainstream humanitarian relief organizations. The Joint and Hadassah thus redirected their efforts to preventing Jewish disease and improving Jewish fitness in what they saw as redeemable Jewish backwaters of the East, otherwise known as Palestine, Poland, and Ukraine, as the Rockefeller Foundation and the American Red Cross put their dollars and expertise into lifting up other less established civilizations than their own and expanding American medical hegemony into Europe. In Poland and in Palestine, and to some degree in Soviet Russia, Jewish social medicine created public health nursing schools, tackled specific diseases that seemed within reach of eradication, like trachoma and phavis, created educational programs and propaganda, and focused on child health and the Jewish future in particular. The Joint after World War I never thought of itself as an organization that was going to be around forever. So it was also hoping to eventually leave Europe. And as such, they followed the Rockefeller Foundation in its style of American philanthropy, where it kind of did short-term projects where it hoped to demonstrate best practices and to build some local medical capacity, rather than to wholesale import progressive American public health practices straight into East Central Europe. So this whole idea is not unlike what came to be known generally as international development work after the next World War. But in this era, it was very uniquely undertaken by a single diaspora people over a vast geopolitical space. And this unexpectedly led to an ambitious, ongoing, continuously demanding local program, which looked as much to Jewish medicine in Russia as it did to America for guidance. It included a new nurses training school, since the American Red Cross barred Jewish women from attending their nursing school in Warsaw. And at the urging of a Polish Jewish woman physician, an American nurse arrived to establish that new nurses training school on a New York curriculum. The Joint's initiative left enough space for local Jews to build their own social medical program, though, too, especially after 1923, when the Joint turned control of its medical work over to the new Polish Jewish Health Organization, which it had helped rekindle from the old Russian OZ, the TOZ. The TOZ, using American Jewish dollars, conceived of the reform of Jewish health work as an opportunity to resist both anti-Semitism and assimilation by providing a separate way for Polish Jews to modernize in the Poland in which they lived. So any kind of visions of American pluralist integration quickly evaporated. And that especially evaporated when continued efforts to collaborate with local officials failed. And in Russia itself, the OZ, the old OZ, which was still there, sort of tottered on with the financial support of the Joint and connections to this new European TOZ. Meanwhile, Hadassah was exporting the best of American progressive era public health projects to more holistically improve all of Jewish society in the land where it was imported, which included establishing the Hadassah Medical Organization and a nurses training school, also on the New York Standard, to create Jewish nurses locally in Palestine. Hadassah continued to support women and children, especially in a variety of ways, through medicine and other forms of social welfare. As the 1920s ticked along, the cause of Jewish health remained a major activity of Jewish life from Palestine to Poland and a core means of asserting Jewish autonomy and expertise. And the Joint itself provided continued financing for these kinds of rehabilitative projects until the economic crash, global crash in 1929. Although it was not immediately obvious that Jewish health would be a way for Americans to facilitate Jewish self-help in Europe, it became a non-divisive, widely supported way of aiding Eastern Jews towards an autonomy that was otherwise lacking. The Joint's foray into medical work tapped into a profound nationalist strain in Eastern European Jewish life, in fact. For European Jews and Zionists, Jewish health in modernity was more about finding answers to the Jewish question from within than about applying the latest bacteriological methods, and more about the health of Jewish society than about the sickness of any particular individual. The Joint gave money, tools, and US backing to this enterprise as it handed over responsibility to local medical organizations, which carried on this work until the Holocaust. And Hadassah actively promoted a Zionism centered in Palestine, bringing even more expertise and maintaining American Jewish control over medical matters into the creation of the State of Israel. Launching an international Jewish health program from America took both a general post-war international health effort and also the dire extremes of epidemic and demographic and economic shifts in Jewish life. These were all fundamentally international projects, international health development projects. But for example, the OZ would never become a candidate for mainstream international health projects at the time, since it was just this kind of semi-legal organization in a system of nation states, although it undertook the kind of activity that the Rockefeller Foundation supported. Jewish health associations were never able to achieve substantive international collaborations despite their persistence, and so it became evident that Jewish healthcare had to just operate independently of the international and nation-state health regime for Jews to have any healthcare at all. So they turned inward among Jews, which could actually include Jews in faraway lands if need be. Jewish hygiene and health programs served an ideology suggesting that Jews could and should care for the health of other Jews, and that this would improve Jewish solidarity and Jewish status at the same time. The Joint was seeking to improve Jewish life in one way that seemed within reach, because this whole medical humanitarianism idea did not precariously depend on outside forces like changing state borders, and it did not stir up political controversy. It appeared to be peaceful, stabilizing force for democracy in Europe and for the Jews within it. The Holocaust, of course, destroyed all of what had been created in Europe irreparably. Jewish doctors continued their desperate work in ghettos and camps, and the Ozé attempted to continue to care for children however it could. The distortion of Jewish racial science in World War II, which would turn Jewish self-help through Jewish health projects on their head, could not have been imagined in the 1920s. But soon after the war was over and camps liberated, Jewish medical humanitarianism quickly reemerged. Surviving doctors, supported by the JDC, gave care to their fellow DPs. But also, as Jews in North Africa suddenly came into the orbit of American humanitarian relief after the Second World War, which is a project my PhD student, Julia Schulte-Werning, is working on, clinics became the space of encounter between recipients and providers of humanitarian aid until Jews left these lands and Israel started to export its medical knowledge instead. While the Jewish diaspora has not really found a raison d'etre for medical humanitarianism past the Cold War, even though other forms of Jewish diaspora humanitarianism have truly persisted, since becoming a state, Israel has frequently touted its health system at home and abroad. It has trained doctors and medical and social workers from other countries, from Africa especially, and deployed medical humanitarianism in disaster zones around the world. Jewish medical humanitarianism has transformed today, in other words, into a feature of Israeli soft diplomacy. Interestingly, IsraAid in October has just for the first time launched a large-scale humanitarian response within Israel itself. So thanks again. Time to ask me questions. Here are some things that you could ask me about, but don't feel like you have to. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jaclyn. And I know that Howard would have been fascinated by what you outlined. He did some work on 1920s British Jewish medical responses, particularly influenced by race science, and some of the latter parts of your paper very much tied in very much with what he was finding out in the UK context. So can we open it up for questions both from in the room and also online? So who would like to start us off? Nushka.
Do introduce yourselves to me so I kind of know where you're coming from.
My name is Nushka. I'm English. I was interested in the different collaborations that you were talking about, both within different Jewish organizations and with the Jewish and American and non-Jewish organizations. And I wondered whether there were any, you talked about obviously developing lack of support or lack of kind of consent. I wondered if there are any instances of sort of outstanding or remarkable organizations that did collaborate between Jewish and non-Jewish, or any particular individuals there?
In the medical sphere, there are not really many examples. One very interesting person, and there's an existing biography of him, but it doesn't explore his Jewish side, is the person of Ludwig Rachman, who was a Polish Jewish doctor who was like the head of the League of Nations effort to combat typhus, and then returned to Poland to also combat typhus. And like he was a very kind of integrated elite Jew and didn't really identify closely with Judaism, but he also like didn't entirely not identify with Judaism. So like Jews did kind of turn to him to try to facilitate a collaboration with the League of Nations, say, but just the League of Nations didn't manage to do much. Almost all of the League of Nations successes were more like collecting data and processing data than like actually doing anything. But in the non-medical sphere, the one organization that kind of consistently worked very closely with Jewish organizations were Quaker organizations, like both the American Friends Service Committee and the British Friends. And that was like really crucial for the Joint in several places. Like the only way the Joint could get any humanitarian aid to Jews after the Russian Revolution for several years was via Quakers. And that kind of relationship, I think, persisted well after World War I into World War II. So that's a really like positive collaboration, but not specifically in like kind of the realms of health.
Hi, thanks very much. Sami, we introduced each other earlier. So I was interested in, at the discursive level, if you could maybe give us some examples of, at one point you spoke about contagion and the way it operated discursively amongst Jewish medical professionals in their thinking about the anti-Semitism as a form of contagion and typhus, and if those two things were allied discursively, and if you have examples of that, or was it, is this a kind of, yeah, I guess I mean they operate at different levels. I was curious about that. I found that interesting in your talk.
So I guess what I would have to say about like the Joint and its decision makers and its social workers is that they're all like very practical people, and their jobs are very like practically oriented, and they're usually like enormously overwhelming jobs and huge decisions to be made kind of very quickly. And so something that characterizes the Joint's archives and like all of these organizations' archives and is that they're not kind of written in a way in which they like themselves like discursively like discuss anything. They like most of the things you hear from me are like what I've come to a conclusion about how they think about things based on like hundreds and hundreds of pages of like minutes and reports and like statistics and how they've chosen to collect statistics and why they've sometimes justified to somebody else why they've made a decision. So, and obviously like also these organizations have many, many different people and voices working within them. So like where you're most likely to, so it's hard to say like, do they have kind of, does the Joint discuss this in this way? And that this kind of discussion happens most in like a conference where they would discuss things. I don't recall ever seeing them say like anti-Semitism is a contagion. I didn't think of it that way. In fact, somewhat remarkably, they barely discuss anti-Semitism at all. Like what is really clear is that they all just know and assume anti-Semitism is happening all over all the time, and they don't need to like justify or explain it to their coworkers. Like, it's just there. Like, they don't need to say this violence was anti-Semitic, or like label it this was and this wasn't. Like, it's just there. So you often only even hear like the language of anti-Semitism when they're sort of trying to discuss to some external partner, and often not non-Jewish external partners either, because they don't think that like external partners are going to understand that language. So it's like if they're writing a letter to other Jews outside of their organizations, they might kind of describe this. So like, no, that I don't recall seeing, but that doesn't mean they weren't thinking of it that way. I think like this kind of subtext of like working against anti-Semitism is just like ever present and affects absolutely everything that they do. And it's like a major difference between the Joint and other humanitarian, like non-Jewish humanitarian associations, is that the Joint has to plan all of its humanitarian aid thinking about like, will this make anti-Semitism worse, or will this make anti-Semitism better? And no other peer organization has to ask that question. And so like all of their decisions often kind of discuss this, but not explicitly.
I had a question around the kind of experience of the relief workers themselves, right? Is it possible to find these individual stories of these workers within at the archive as opposed to the institution itself? And how do they experience going to these places or not going to them? Or was it, is it possible to use eager documents separate to the kind of these archives to find out more about the relief workers?
Some of them. So like American relief workers are pretty well, you can kind of keep track of them, especially the ones in like more, the earliest ones and the ones who are in more of a leadership role. Sometimes you can just, I mean, the way that reports were collected in that moment of time did allow some kind of, like, it wasn't a tick box exercise. There wasn't like a kind of evaluation form where they had to like write a standard report like so-and-so. So like their reports are kind of letters. And so if you read a ton of their reports, you can kind of see their characters emerge as they kind of try to process what's happening to them, as well as like reporting on what's happening on the ground. And some of the workers have like separate family or individual papers in other archives, which I try to look at. Like James Becker was like in his early 20s, and he joined he graduated from Cornell. His dad was a banker in Chicago, and like right after college or right after uni, he like joined the US Army, and then the Joint basically tapped him to like be one of their first aid providers in Europe. And his letters home to his parents during these years are like sitting in Cincinnati, Ohio, at the American Jewish Archives. They're like all like these handwritten letters. So I went through some of them, for example, and you can like really see how completely overwhelmed he is by this, which is really interesting. And like, the thing is though, that from pretty early on, like if you look at the numbers of the Joint sending over, like, like 18 medical staff for like all of Poland. But you look at even at like that picture of just that like typhus machine, there's all of these local workers who the Joint hires. Like one of the things that these American humanitarian workers are doing is like they arrive and then they hire a whole bunch of local people. And the locals it's very difficult to access their voices. There's a few exceptions. For example, like there's some literature like Ansky or Isaac Babel. I mean, Babel was not a humanitarian relief worker, but Ansky, whose like diary and his Horden Galicia, like very well known, he gathered this material while being a relief worker. And there was a very recent publication of Ellie Gumener's Yiddish diary translated into English by Michael Nutkovitz. And Gumener was also like a relief worker in Soviet Ukraine. And so now we have like available to us this kind of not only translated, but also like edited with an introduction. And there's some kind of early, almost like Yizkor books as well. And some of those Yizkor books are kind of put together by like relief workers. There's like a whole bunch of refugees that collect on the border between Ukraine and Romania at the Dniester River. And like there's a humanitarian worker who's like also a journalist who like goes around speaking to these refugees and then like writes about it, and you can find that. It's like a semi-published thing. So yes, but also it's almost impossible to really like there's such a diversity of experience, and it's hard to figure out how to grapple with those. And it's even harder to grapple with like the recipients of aid who like some recipients of aid went on to write things, or like if you know of the like YIVO autobiography competition that happened in the interwar period, like all of those children writing in, like the humanitarian relief is just like there, like it's there in all kinds of writings from Jews in the interwar period. So it's like you can see these, it's just like not organized around that, so it can be very difficult to find them and know how to make sense of them.
Could I ask, I think it was when Howard did his PhD as a medical practitioner, he was interested to know whether the German hospital, the Jewish hospital, was ahead or behind the times. And you know, this is a crude generalization of his work, but he found the German hospital was ahead and the Jewish hospital was slightly behind, or very limited in its approach. Do you have any sense of whether the Jewish relief, medical relief, was more cutting edge or the same or inferior?
Well, I alluded to this briefly, but I think that American humanitarianism at that time, and like was really coming out of this era of kind of science and rationalization, and like the American Relief Administration spent a lot of time trying to think about like what should go in a food package. Should this be like how many like the idea of calories was sort of new, like how do we get people the right number of calories, like what should we do? And they're consulting all of these kind of experts, and the Joint kind of is like, right, we'll let the American Relief Administration figure that out, and we'll just do the same thing as them and make sure it's kosher. So the Joint spent like hardly any of its efforts to kind of create its own scientific expertise in any front, but they did like hire experts, like Harry Plotz, that first kind of medical person who went over there. He was hired for this because he was at, I think, Mount Sinai in New York, trying to develop a vaccine against typhus. There were as many different like vaccines against typhus that were being attempted in this moment, and none of them succeeded. And they found him actually to be like an impossible person, because he basically wanted to create Mount Sinai in Poland or in Ukraine, and like that was impossible. So there was always this tension, and I think it would be quite different to like say a hospital in the UK of like, where exactly do you expect living standards to be? If you're providing like American aid and you want things to improve in Eastern Europe or in Palestine, what level are you going for? Are you trying to like make it like New York, or are you trying to make it like Russian medicine, which like has its own tradition? Or like, where do you go? How, like what, and when do you decide you can kind of end, and how much money do you sink in? So I would say that this stuff was not particularly like cutting edge science, but if experts knew about it and they could fund it, like it would happen. Like they were aware of what cutting edge science was, I guess.
Thank you. You mentioned in your response to my last question about the photograph of the typhus machine that they were using. With the photographs that do exist in the joint archive, then what purpose did they serve? Are these photographs that are taken for personal use? Are they for publications? Are they for the reports? Why do we have these photos, and who took them, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not specifically related to the medical thing at all. There's actually, so obviously, like, the ability to take photography and to kind of have it be a fairly like mass-produced thing, where it's like they're able to kind of take a camera with them into some of these places, is a new thing of this war. There's a lot more images of the war and the interwar period than like previous wars. The joint archives, I mean, any of you could like Google right now, like the joint has digitized all of its archives from its early years and includes their massive photo archive. It's like huge. I've spent so many hours like trawling through their photos, trying to like ask myself some of those questions. And I have thought about like possibly writing like another book or an article or something like specifically on this question. But like, I think they were doing it for fundraising purposes, which explains a huge preponderance of images of children. Like, so like almost all medical related images, if they're not, are like of children, like receiving services. And there's just so many pictures of children. And then they kind of, then there's like, I think a set of images that are about like documenting some of their work. Like another part of their program was to like try to help people rebuild their houses that had been like destroyed by fire and bombs. And so you see there's like endless images of like houses, which are very hard to figure out like any context around. And then there's also like some kind of self-documentation. And those are most of the things that I'm kind of have in the PowerPoint, which are like photos of themselves, like their trainees, their workers. And what I think is really different about the photos of then versus humanitarian photos today is that you almost never see both the recipients of aid and the workers in the same image. They're always separate. Or like you don't see the like workers and the house and the recipients, like whatever they've fixed or built, like it's all they're always like very separate images. And so like I always feel like in my kind of today's sensibilities, like I would love to like have these kind of images where you kind of see recipients and caregivers like interacting, and it's like pretty not there. Although some exceptions are like these kinds of images, and one of them I showed a kind of medical, sometimes you sort of see somebody receiving some kind of medical aid and they're in the same thing. Yeah. I don't know. I don't have much more to say about like why that is exactly.
Just following on, there was two images you saw under each other. One of the delousing team, wonderful sort of mixture of people that look like a sort of mafiosi, but very mixed, 50-50. And then the one below of the Warsaw Health Unit, where there are 20 people, 2 women. Could you say a little bit more about the gender, sort of?
Yeah.
Of who's doing what, and why is that delousing team seem to be more integrated in them? Well,
something I am endlessly fascinated by, and I want more people to write about them, are the like Russian women doctors. So like, as I mentioned, in the late 19th century, Jewish women like are able to train as medical doctors if they can manage to get themselves to Central Europe. And so there are actually quite a number of like Jewish women doctors who are like the locals. And they're some of the people who, like, the joint arrives and then they like get hired to do things. So like there's some of the people I think in the photo. That photo doesn't have any names, unfortunately. Like I don't know like exactly what each person's role is. And it's the only photo that I've found of this delousing thing. But then like the Americans who are the ones doing the traveling, like the women in America and like in kind of Western societies in this era, like professional women are becoming nurses, and they're becoming social workers, like in professions that relate to humanitarianism. So like the joint sends abroad a few women as social workers and nurses, mostly to do things related to healthcare and children. So like basically women are there. They're there in the joint more than they are in like in kind of some positions of leadership, more than they are in like other American humanitarian organizations. But if you think about like any Red Cross, like the Red Cross is fully staffed with like the workers are like women nurses. So they're like the medical. One of the things I think is most interesting about medical humanitarianism in particular is this way in which like you see more women present, but they're still not necessarily in kind of leading positions. They're like the professional working group.
Are there any questions in Zoom?
You're really getting your money's worth tonight. Okay, so I think that's unless there are other questions from the floor. Batman in lilac in the middle row, but no. So Charlie, ask the last question.
Can we see in the practice of the joint other, do we see continuums between First World War medical humanitarianism and that which happens after the Second World War and during that period? Do we see, because you mentioned that the kind of infrastructures were destroyed during the war, do we split? Are there continuums, are there threads, are there similar people, similar processes that are occurring at the Holocaust as they are after?
Yeah, I mean, it's less my like area of specific expertise and more what I've read. And there's some like emerging literature kind of coming out on this. So I'm kind of hesitant to like say too much before I know, because those books are not yet written or published. But I think that there's certainly still like so much of what happens of the Jewish like humanitarian type of response to the Holocaust is shaped by the Jewish response to the First World War. And that is like both what expectations are of what's going to happen in war. So like a kind of realizing there's going to be like really bad effects on the Jews, but probably not anticipating the genocide that occurred. But also like what kinds of things can be done to kind of respond. And so I think that like absolutely like a kind of first impulse is like we just do the same programs we did in the previous generation. The leaders of the joint in World War II are largely the like kind of young 20-somethings who were in the joint already in the First World War. So they're like, there's not a huge change in like the kind of people who are there. So I think that, I mean, as I briefly mentioned, like certainly as soon as like in the camps themselves, like one of the people who I wonder if is in that photo of the delousing machine, but I don't know. There's this Polish Jewish woman doctor, Sophia Bienstock Sirkin Bienstock, who like worked in the Warsaw Ghetto providing humanitarian medical relief like throughout the Holocaust in the ghetto. And in this era, she's like head of like medical education for the Joint in Warsaw. So like, but like during the Holocaust, the Joint couldn't really like, like during the First World War, like they actually didn't really have direct contact. It was like too hard. So it's sort of like, what is Jewish humanitarianism during the Holocaust itself? Hard to say. Afterwards, there's obviously like there are lots of Jewish doctors who immediately kind of leap in to try to heal. There's even more of an argument to be made that those have to be Jewish doctors and not other kinds of doctors. And also an enormous new humanitarian program aimed at North Africa, which is largely around kind of medical humanitarianism and like work training to try to kind of industrialize Jews of North Africa. So yes, it continues at least for like a few decades after that.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. It's been within, as I said at the beginning, a tradition of very, very powerful lectures in Jewish medical history in memory of Howard. And if you're interested in pursuing Jaclyn's work further, her book on international Jewish humanitarianism is available in paperback. I think that looks very handsome.
I brought a couple of copies with me if anyone wants it.
And also her lecture is sort of tied in with, thank you, Debbie McGee.
Exactly what I wanted you to do. Thank you.
The lecture this evening is also sort of tied into a more recent work which is ongoing on Jewish women's international activism, and Jaclyn is going to be doing some work in the archives here, which are a particularly rich source in that area as well. So thank you very much. It's also been maybe inappropriate that Jaclyn's come here not in best of health. So thank you very much for getting yourself here and giving such a great lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone here.